Yeah, I have to be very conscious of the time. Peter will throw something at me. But I also acknowledge the traditional owners of this area, the elders past, present and emerging. And we have a lot of involvement with them actually in our project. So TS Onslow is, look from here, where do we go to? This one dropped off, did it? Anyway, TS Onslow, the Australian Navy Cadets. We had a shoreline rehabilitation project. It's a training base located at the Esplanade Golden Beach, Caloundra, and the land on which the building is located is owned by the state government. It has been reclaimed fill from a nearby building site. In 1970, it was reclaimed in 1977. They leased it to TS Onslow for 30 years, and with the requirement that they address any erosion issues. It's a bit like hiring a car and having to look after the tyres on it, isn't it? Erosion was originally managed simply by shoreline vegetation, and in the mid-1980s, the rate of erosion increased. In 1986, concrete blocks were placed along the shoreline on the southern end of the lease in an attempt to contain it. In 2008, the lease was renewed, and I can't show you these pictures, that should come up. And in 2009, there was some erosion on the northern side. Aha, here we are. Okay, there's a spot on here. So that's the lease area, the dark line, and on the southern part of this area here is where they placed the blocks in 1986. And the next slide should show what the site north of that was like in 2000. Now in 2009 they had to place some blocks along there to combat the erosion in that region there. So in 2009 these were the blocks that were placed there, and you can see this is the site in 2014. So something's interesting is going on there when the Department of Environment said they had to remove the blocks and consider an engineered sort of process to combat erosion. That was beyond the cost capabilities of TS Onslow, and they employed Australian Wetland Consulting to have a look at the site, give us some options in 2011. In the end result of that was that they suggested maybe we should use soft engineering. So in 2014, there was a meeting with some community people and the appropriate department people, and that gave us approval to go ahead and plant some mangroves and see how that worked. So the process from there in 2015, we started a process of planting, and we use coir logs as a standard area for containing the sand, but they were put in a fish scale pattern. As you can see in that further earlier picture, that's to stop the transverse sand movement. We had Bunya Bunya Country Aboriginal Corporation propagate and plant the mangroves for us, and we had the community planting coastal vegetation. Now, after that, we ended up with, we'll skip that slide, and we ended up with this problem. We had some very heavy rain in the area again, and it was obvious that we were going to lose the site just from overland flow. And to combat that, we put a sediment fence around the site temporarily, waiting till such times as our coastal vegetation, our shoreline vegetation established. In 2016, that had established sufficiently to retain the site, and the council fenced it for us and made it look a little bit neater and tidier. We had a visit from the Minister in 2019. The state government gave TAP a grant to work on stage 2 And so they came up to have a look and see what we're actually doing, and there was some replenishment planting going on at that stage, which was an opportune time for the Minister to be there. Our site, stage 1 site, you can see where the mangroves grow there, as Professor Norman Duke spoke earlier about them being in a sweet spot. I sort of think of mangroves a little bit like people. They have their favourite places to be, and then as they establish there, they have their social communities, but then they start to spread out in the suburbs. You can see there where these mangroves are growing out a little bit further, and we hope that over a period of time that they will spread even further. And stage 2, of course, was funded by the Australian government's National Land Plan through Healthy Land and Water. We had our state government grant, and we had funding from the Powerboat Club. We had heaps of advice. We had Mangrove Watch do the design and the encouragement to continue with it, and so on. In 2015, the northern site looked like that. If you look at the trees and the length of the kayak, you'll find that there's probably about 4 metres between that and that. In 2019, we got kissed by Cyclone Omar, and it looked like that. There's about 0.5 metre or 1 metre at best between the trees and the bank, which meant we had to do that before we could do anything further. Then the next process, of course, is to have sand pumped onto the site, which the council did in June in 2019. And because of the requirements for so many approvals, the development application we needed, hold-ups in delays that nearly drove our management with Susie Chapman was almost demented over the issues of getting the approvals for us. In July, we only had that much of the sand left. So it just goes to show that without something else, sand nourishment on a beach is not always that successful. What we did here, we put coir logs along the area, as we did with the first stage. We used them in two fashions. One was the fish scale pattern under the tide area, which is meant to help to retain the sand from moving transversely. And at the tide line, we placed them in lengthwise and along the front. We also took the opportunity to trial 2 other products, one of them being oyster triangles or interlocking concrete blocks. And these are placed along the front edge to break up tide action, to allow an area for oyster recruitment, and to help to retain the front of the site. The other product we trialled was a product called BEES, or Biodegradable Engineering System Elements. Looks a bit like plastic egg crates, actually. And we placed those there. We planted mangroves in them. The intention was to help retain the mangroves till they established. The other thing was to accrete sand. And the other problem that we got with those that we didn't think about was the fact that kids use them as hopscotch areas. They jump from plate to plate, which didn't do it any good. These biodegrade in about 2 years. They're made in the Netherlands from a byproduct of potato processing. The happy crew, after the vegetation was planted on the shoreline above our tide level, and you can see the bees attached down there, and the coir logs at the tide line at the front. An aerial view of it. Now, an interesting thing in there is that we had nothing placed on top of that area to hold the coir logs down. Coir logs are very light and floaty, and they have a buoyancy. So when we buried them, and of course they get wet as the sand saturates, and they tend to want to float. Had we been able to wet them first or pegged them down with something a bit heavier, gravel them on top, it would have helped. But that was the site when it was first initially completed. Then we had the big storms in December this year, in 2020, I should say. The tide was a little higher than normal. It didn't go over the top of our row of coir logs at the tide line, and effectively it did no damage other than a little bit of dieback, and it actually accreted sand on site. So we're not eroding the area anymore. You can see the fresh white sand where it's built up in that region. Our biggest disappointment is that people tramp on the mangroves, and then, oh, go back one, that one there, is the greatest disappointment is where we had some mangroves in site one broken off just through plain vandalism. But you can see the benefits long term of the Rhizophora or red mangrove root system. That will make a very, very secure, solid anchor for sand accretion, and it's also a darn good area to hide fish. So if people that stay off it for long enough, they get more fish in that area. So thank you.